Oh, hey, how's it going? So I was looking through some of the videos that I put together for you guys, and I noticed that there's a few details that I'm sort of missing. So my plan is to sort of go through the videos and pull out different things that I mentioned that need more explaining or expansion on, or more explanation. So I wanted to sort of play on this idea in my video, how to draw a leaf. I started talking about structure. And I wanted to give you just a little bit more details on how to play with structure, what structure is all about, and sort of how do we apply that, and what is it used for in drawing and painting. All right, so here we go. So in art, there are some basic shapes that you want to get into your toolbox. Sort of own these specific shapes. A circle. Triangle, and a square. And these are sort of your basic shapes that we want to play with, that we can build anything out of. And there are variations on each one of these shapes. So this circle can also be sort of an oval shape. It can even turn into more of like an ellipse shape, like the top of a teacup. So you can see how there's variations just on this tiny idea of a circle. There's variations on it. And then it eventually becomes three-dimensional, and we sort of draw the sphere. And you can check out my video on value on how we manipulate sort of darks and lights to create the illusion of space on a flat piece of paper. So here I'm just sort of playing with this idea that this circle is now a sphere, almost like it's transparent. I can see right through it, developing it. And if I go in and sort of play with some cross hatching, so I'm going to create some lines moving on this object. And then going in another direction, crossing the lines, cross hatching, developing some value on this object. And in the video on value, I talk about sort of some rules in creating values and creating objects that look three-dimensional with a highlight. And I can kind of mush this together a little bit. It's just a sort of mechanical pencil on a page. And then I can go in and even create this even darker down here. So again, we start with this one simple idea of a circle. There's variations on the circle. Even an egg sort of shape can be a sort of variation on that circle idea. An ellipse, and even a very extreme ellipse, the top of a coffee cup when you turn the circle on its side. And then that circle, that two-dimensional shape, eventually becomes a three-dimensional shape. Now let's talk about this. And also this, before we get to this triangle, this also can be something we can be considered if we take an ellipse here and we draw two lines coming off of it. we develop this shape called a cylinder. And those are all sort of variations on this first initial idea of a circle. So you got to have a circle as a sort of primary tool in your toolbox. And then we can start talking and unpacking this triangle shape. And to make this three-dimensional, there's a couple of different things you can do. You can make it seem like it has planes, sort of like the top of a roof, thinking that it has, if we can see through the object, this idea that there's these planes here. And then depending on where the light would be hitting, let's say the light is coming from this direction, it would be lightest here, and then as it moved away from the light, it would get darker on this side. So it's not hitting the light. And then we can take that first initial triangle and it can also become a cone. So it's a sort of a variation on this cylinder shape. So we have the sort of ellipse of that circle that then comes up to a point. Again, drawing it like as if you can see through the shape, or maybe it's the bottom part of it, like an upside down ice cream cone shape. And again, this also could have sort of that tactility of the cross hatching, bringing those lines. And you can even imagine that you can kind of go right through the object, as if you can wrap that like a piece of string or something all around the whole object. Around. And then depending on if the light, where the light was coming from, if we're imagining that the light is coming from the top here, then this would probably, we actually probably wouldn't even see this. This would be sort of colored. This would sort of be the back of it if we and then some lighter values. So then you create this cone shape. All right, so now we're building on this idea of shapes, sort of primary shapes that we work with that are going to help us build structure and how we see everything. You kind of want these primary shapes under your belt. And then the square shape is also a variation of the rectangular shape. And also, if you think about it, it is sort of a variation of the cylinder shape. So they start to kind of repeat themselves in different variations. So again, if we have a cube, we take that initial square shape and we think it has a plane at the top here. On each side, make it a three-dimensional shape. And if we imagine that the light is coming maybe from this direction, it's going to hit this plane, and then there would be a sort of softer grayish value. And then we'd have the darkest plane, the plane that's furthest away and not getting a lot of light. And that's going to create a sense of sort of space. just by playing with the planes. So this is a flat piece of paper, and if we just draw the shapes as two-dimensional shapes, they're going to stay flat. As soon as we start adding this idea of planes, these planes, so this is a plane of the cube, this is another plane of the cube, is how the sides and the object moves through the space. And then even rounded objects, they have a sort of rounded tactility to them. When you start moving your tools, your mark making tools around objects, you want to make sure that you're sort of going along and being tactile about how you touch and draw the objects with your tool. And then these are the basic shapes that you want to really hone in on and own. They need to really be a part of your toolbox. These are the basis of being able to build anything, from buildings to figures, flowers, landscapes, anything that you want to draw. You're going to want to have this basic shape structure under your belt. All right, so now that we are building our repertoire on basic shapes that we want to have in our toolbox, the circle, triangle, and the square, and then different variations on those shapes, and then building these shapes up with planes and values to give them the illusion that they're three-dimensional. I thought we'd try it out together and show you how to break it down. How does that actually apply to things that we're drawing from? So I have this little mushroom character here. We have these three shapes now that we want to have kind of in our toolbox: the circle, triangle, and the square, and then there's variations on these shapes. So we can stretch them and sort of put them on their side or build planes with them to create three-dimensional shapes. So let's look at this object now. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to play with the first thing that we talked about before, is this idea of a gesture, and maybe just sort of throw down where you think the longest part of an object is. So if I could imagine sort of my tool on the object, where would be the longest point on this object? And then the widest. And you can actually use your tool to measure and sort of kind of put it onto the page where you think it might be, the widest point. And then maybe you might want to start sort of giving yourself some other points to this thing. So we have this line here, you know, maybe give yourself a little just measurement that that's there, and then how far is that little guy, and then the sort of the top part of that little mushroom, and then how long is that? It's about sort of a quarter of this line. So if I think if that's like the half point, it's about a quarter of that. And then we have the sort of tip up there, and then we have the sort of bottom of this that kind of is sort of in the middle but a little bit lower. So I'm just giving myself these little sort of mapping out where this thing exists. You can see this is a little bit lower than this side, so if I go back to that original mark and think about where that sort of starts, it's a little bit higher. And then also sort of the width of these things, we could sort of go along and sort of give ourselves some little measurements about how wide, how far apart they are from each other. And where they start, where they stop. Just give yourself some little points. I'm just sort of pinpointing, measuring it really. Just eyeballing where the things exist in the space. All right, so then once you get sort of an idea as to what is happening, you want to go back to these sort of shapes that we're building and using and sort of see where you can apply them. So I see that these little mushroom tops are like our cones. They have specific qualities to them. So I'm going to match them up to what I see here. But just knowing that it is a cone shape is now going to allow me to have the ability to make it look more three-dimensional with that cone shape. And then there's another cone shape here. So there's the rounded part on the bottom. It goes up. I'm just making a sort of suggestion of where it is. Space. And then there's a little bit. And then not only do they have the bottoms, but then they kind of have an upside down sort of cone shape happening. And then if you think about where that cylinder that we worked with, again, I'm just sort of going along, measuring out where this object actually exists in space. So we can see this cone shape is in there, a variation on that cone shape. So the circular bottom, and then you see it has like a little bit of a cone shape on the bottom that turns into, each of these sort of have a cylinder shape. So I'm just going to start it with a cylinder shape. It does bend, so I'm going to kind of bring that cylinder over. But imagine that it has that sort of cylindrical ellipse down there at the bottom. And so I'm building the structure of this shape here. Really kind of looking and searching out for these simple shapes. So another cylindrical shape. And if I really look, it does sort of bend a bit, so bringing that cylinder kind of over, noticing where it stops. It stops a little bit above where this one starts and stops. Go. And then this guy here, still kind of adjusting. You can see I'm kind of adjusting it as I move along, trying to get it to be closer and closer to what it is that I'm looking at. And then this little sort of cylinder on the top here. Sort of fit that in there. And it has another little cylinder off of the bottom, upside down. And then this whole thing is sort of sitting on a kind of fat cone, or sort of a half a sphere actually. If I think about that, I can kind of imagine it has a half of a sphere. And you might see, I'm on the side over here, so I see a little bit at the bottom of it, but you guys probably just see a sort of rounded sphere shape. And then this cone, this cylinder here comes off of the piece. Comes around. Again, imagining where it kind of connects there. And then afterwards you can kind of go back and play with more of a contour line, like as if your tool is sort of going along the edge of the object. So less of this sort of structural seeing through the shape, but more of sort of grabbing a hold of what it sort of feels like on the contour there. Going around. And then I have a window over on this side, so there's some light coming in on this side. You start to see some of the shadows, so we can start building some of those values, the lights and the darks together, to make it feel more like a three-dimensional shape. And you can use your tool to your advantage, whatever you're using, either charcoal, pencil, markers, oil pastels, whatever you have, you can sort of play with that. There's also, the light is hitting from the top, and then there's a little bit of shadow underneath here. we get to take away our reference, and we're just left with what we've drawn.